Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are not just doing a biography, we are doing an origin story. And honestly, we are tackling what I like to call the final boss of philosophy.
That is a very apt description. I mean, if you play video games, this is the boss with the giant health bar that just makes you want to throw the controller at the screen.
Exactly. We are talking about Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and I know, I can practically hear the collective groan from everyone listening. You hear the name Hegel, and your brain just immediately shuts down.
Right. You think of the statue, the marble bust of this very serious older man who is somehow responsible for everything from Marxism to fascism. But, no one can quite explain why.
Yeah, you think of unreadable books, sentences that go on for literally 3 pages, and this dusty German guy who thinks the state is God. And of course, everyone remembers, or at least thinks they remember, that one famous formula from Philosophy 101, thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Which brings us to our first real record scratch moment of the deep dive today. Because if we look at our source material, specifically Terry Pinkert's monumental biography of Hegel, we have to start by debunking exactly that.
So let's just rip the Band-Aid off right now. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Did he use it?
No.
Not even once?
Never. Not once in his entire corpus of writing did he use that specific formula to describe his method.
That is mind-blowing to me, because that is literally the only thing I thought I knew about him going into this.
It's basically the greatest marketing trick in the history of philosophy, but Hegel didn't even perform it. That formula was actually popularized by a critic named Heinrich Moritz Chalibius years later to try and simplify Hegel for beginners. And it just stuck because, well, it's catchy.
Right, it fits nicely on a chalkboard.
Exactly. But Hegel's actual thinking is much more organic, much more fluid. It's more like a plant growing, a seed becoming a bud and then a blossom. You can't just slap a mechanical grid like thesis and antithesis onto it.
Okay, so if he isn't the thesis antithesis guy, and he isn't just this dusty defender of the Prussian status quo, who on earth is he? Because the mission for today's deep dive is to rescue the actual human being buried under 200 years of academic intimidation.
That is exactly the mission. And Pinkert's biography is the perfect tool for it, because it refuses to start with the great philosopher capital G, capital P. Instead, it gives us a portrait of a man born right on the jagged edge of the modern world. We are looking at a young man living through the absolute trauma of the French Revolution, the upheaval of the Industrial Revolution, and the total collapse of the old European order.
And the thing that really hooked me in the reading is that for a long time, he doesn't look like a genius at all. He looks like a guy who is struggling, flailing even.
Oh, he is the ultimate late bloomer. That is the narrative arc we are going to trace today. We're exploring Hegel's lost years. I mean, we are talking about a guy who loved wine, loved gossip, loved women, and was ironically nicknamed the old man by his college roommates because he was just so slow and depressing. A guy who totally failed to launch his career until he was in his 30s.
Which is so relatable. We tend to assume these geniuses just pop out of the womb writing treatises on logic, but Hegel had to go through a solid decade of failure to become the Hegel we read about.
And the argument we're going to test today, which the source material heavily leans into, is that the failure was necessary. That you cannot understand the modern world or Hegel's explanation of it without understanding the personal crisis he went through as a young man.
So let's rewind the clock. We are dropping into the year 1770. The place is Württemberg. Now, I need you to set the scene first, because Germany didn't really exist yet, right?
Not even close. If you looked at a map of Europe in 1770, the center of the continent looked like someone had dropped a puzzle on the floor and lost half the pieces. It was the Holy Roman Empire.
Which, as the old joke goes,
neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Exactly. It was this messy patchwork of hundreds of little principalities, duchies, bishoprics, and free cities. There was no Germanation. There was just a shared language and culture. Württemberg, where Hegel was born, was a duchy in the southwest. And it was a very peculiar place.
How so? Like, what was the vibe?
Well, it wasn't a modern state with a centralized government in the way we think of France or England at the time. It was a collection of what historians call hometowns.
Hometowns. That sounds kind of cozy, honestly.
It was cozy, but it was also suffocating. Think of insular, walled-off communities. Everything is governed by guilds, by local notables, by these unwritten traditional rules. It's a place where everyone knows your business, everyone knows your rank, and everyone is utterly obsessed with their traditional rights. You couldn't just move to a new town and open a shop. You had to have the right lineage, the right permissions. It was completely static.
And Hegel is born right into this static environment in 1770, but the notes mention that 1770 was also a deeply politically charged year for Württemberg specifically, something called the Constitutional Settlement. That sounds a bit dry on the surface, but I get the feeling it's crucial for his childhood.
It is incredibly important.
Yeah.
It completely defined the atmosphere of his family's dinner table. Basically, the ruler of Württemberg was Duke Karl Eugen. Now, Karl Eugen wanted to be a fancy French-style absolutist king. He looked at Versailles and said, I want that. He wanted to build massive palaces, fund expensive ballets, and basically draft the local boys into his army just to rent them out as mercenaries to other countries.
Wow, just classic tyrant behavior.
Right. But the local elites in Württemberg, they were called the estates. They weren't having it. They fought back. And they controlled the purse strings. So in 1770, the very year Hegel was born, they forced the Duke to sign a deal, the Constitutional Settlement. It said, essentially, you can stay the Duke, but you have to respect the traditional rights of the people. You can't just take our money or our sons whenever you feel like it.
Okay, so Hegel grows up in a house where the law and the Constitution aren't just abstract ideas in a civics textbook. They are the literal shield that protects your family's money and safety from the Duke.
Precisely. He absorbs this idea extremely early on, that law is a real, tangible thing and it protects you from arbitrary power. And his family was right in the machinery of this system. His father, Georg Ludwig Hegel, was a secretary at the Ducal Revenue Office.
So his dad worked for the Duke.
He worked for the administration, yeah. He was a man of the system, a total bureaucrat.
The source material describes him as pretty rigid, very much a company man.
Very much so. He was the kind of guy who believed in order, hierarchy, and doing things exactly by the book. He wore the papered wig, he followed all the protocols. Later in life, he and Hegel would actually have massive fights because the father sided with the old feudal order, and Hegel, well, as we'll see, Hegel wanted to burn it down. But the dynamic at home wasn't just about the father. The really interesting parent, honestly, is the mother.
Right. Maria Magdalena Luisa. The biography highlights her as the real intellectual driver of the family.
She was totally exceptional. In 18th century Germany, it was very rare for a woman to have a high level of formal education. It just wasn't something society prioritized. But she was highly literate. She came from a family of lawyers and theologians. She actually taught Hegel Latin before he even started school.
That is a huge head start because Latin was basically the gatekeeper language of the time, wasn't it?
It was the code to everything. If you knew Latin, you could enter the world of scholarship, science, law. If you didn't, you were permanently locked out. So she handed in the keys to the kingdom before he was even 10 years old. She was the one nurturing his mind, buying him books, really pushing him intellectually.
But there is a tragedy here that we have to talk about. And it feels like the first major pivot point in his entire life.
Yes. When Hegel was 11 years old, a bilious fever swept to Stuttgart. We don't know exactly what it was. Historians think probably dysentery or typhus.
Yeah.
But it was brutal. Hegel got sick. His father got sick. His mother got sick.
Yeah.
The men survived. The mother did not.
11 years old. I mean, that is a brutal age to lose your primary caregiver, especially the one you connect with so deeply on an intellectual level.
It's absolutely devastating. And Pinkard, the biographer, argues this was a pivotal psychological break for Hegel. He spent the rest of his life intensely identifying with her memory. He consciously rejected his father's bureaucratic path, the path of the system, and clung to the idea of being a man of letters, exactly like she wanted for him. It instilled this really deep sense of being an outsider in his own home.
So he's living in the house with his father, but emotionally his bags are packed. He's somewhere else.
Exactly. He felt entirely estranged. He was rising middle class. They're well-educated, comfortable, but he wasn't part of the true elite, what they call the Ehrbarkeit, the non-noble notables. And he certainly wasn't happy at home, so he became a very serious, very introverted child.
And he throws himself entirely into school. He goes to the Gymnasium Illoster in Stuttgart. And he develops this persona, the absolute good boy.
The ultimate good boy. He was the kid who sat right in the front row. He was always top of his class. He won the academic prizes every single year. And he started this habit that he kept up for the rest of his life. He kept a diary.
A diary? I mean, that sounds pretty normal for a teenager.
But this wasn't a Dear Diary, I have a huge crush on the baker's daughter kind of diary. It was basically a database.
A database?
He wasn't writing about his feelings at all. He was copying out long excerpts from textbooks, history books, newspapers, and literature. He would copy passages in German and then translate them into Latin. He was meticulously cataloging human knowledge.
He was basically downloading the Enlightenment into his own brain line by line.
That is a perfect way to put it. He was building an external hard drive of knowledge before computers existed. But, and this is crucial, he wasn't just a robot. The biography mentions he had his guilty pleasures too. He was absolutely obsessed with a book called Sophie's Journey from Memel to Saxony.
Sophie's Journey, that sounds thrilling.
To a modern ear, maybe not so much. But in the 18th century, it was a massive blockbuster. It was a sentimental, picaresque novel about a woman traveling across Germany. It was emotional, a bit sappy, full of longing and dramatic landscapes.
So the serious boy who copies out Latin textbooks for fun also likes the 18th century equivalent of a rom-com.
Exactly. It shows that underneath that stiff, scholastic exterior, Hegel really had a romantic streak. He wanted to feel things. He wasn't just a logic machine. And socially, he wasn't a total loner either. He loved playing cards, whist, and tarot, and he actually loved gossip. He was a gregarious young man when he wanted to be. He wanted to be part of the world.
And during this time, he's absorbing this very specific, very German concept of Bildung. We hear this word a lot in German philosophy and history, Bildung. How do we translate that for the listener? Because just saying education doesn't seem to cover the cultural weight of it.
No, education is way too clinical. It's too transactional, like you're just acquiring skills for a job. Bildung is about deep self-cultivation. It's the idea that you are actively sculpting your own soul. You aren't just learning facts. You are shaping yourself into a moral, wise, fully cultivated human being. It's about character building. And Hegel adopted this as his life's mission very early on. He wanted to be a Volksherzier. A Volksherzier, an educator of the people.
Like a public intellectual.
Yes, but with a profoundly moral mission. His big hero was Gotthold Ephraim Lessing. Lessing was a giant of the German Enlightenment. He wrote a famous play called Nathan the Wise. Have you heard of it?
I know the title, but you'll have to remind me of the plot.
It's set in Jerusalem during the Crusades. You have a Jew, a Christian, and a Muslim as the main characters. And the whole point of the play is religious tolerance. It argues that no single religion has the absolute ring of truth, that true religion is actually about how you treat people, about common humanity and ethics.
That must have been pretty radical stuff for the 1700s.
It was completely explosive, and Hegel loved it. He internalized this core idea that religion shouldn't be about rigid dogmas and rules and telling people who is going to hell. It should be about uniting people. It should be the moral glue of society.
Okay, so he's got the brains, he's got the ambition, and he's got this strong moral compass. He graduates top of his class at 1788. He is 18 years old. Where does a smart, ambitious boy from Württemberg go to become an educator of the people?
He goes to the University of Tübingen. But specifically, he enters the theological seminary there, the Stift.
The Stift. Now, when I hear seminary, I think of quiet contemplation, prayer, maybe some nice gardens, guys walking around in robes chanting peacefully. But the description in the source material is, well, it sounds a lot like a prison.
It was definitely closer to a prison than a modern university. You have to understand the institutional setup. Remember our absolutist Duke Karl Eugen?
Yeah.
He paid for the education of the smartest boys in the duchy, but in exchange, they had to become pastors or bureaucrats for the state apparatus.
So it's a golden handcuff situation. Free tuition, but we own your future.
Yes, exactly. And the environment inside the Stift was incredibly stifling. They were housed in a former Augustinian monastery. They had to wear these heavy black coats with white cuffs. Very specific, uncomfortable uniforms that marked them visually as seminarians to everyone in town. They had strict curfews. They were watched constantly by these repetents, older tutors who functioned basically like prison guards or RAs from hell.
And I read there was literally a student jail.
The Karzer, yes. If you broke the rules, if you got drunk, stayed out past curfew, made too much noise, or even if you just didn't pray enthusiastically enough, they locked you up in a literal cell. It was an incredibly repressive atmosphere. And this is the exact place where Hegel, the model good boy, finally snaps.
The rebellion begins. So what does bad boy Hegel actually look like?
Well, he doesn't start setting buildings on fire or anything. He's much more passive-aggressive. He just stops trying. He totally stops being the valedictorian. He starts cutting his classes. He oversleeps constantly. He gets detention records that stretch a mile long. And irony of ironies, this is exactly where he earns the nickname, the Old Man.
The Old Man. Why? Was he acting super wise and mature?
Not because he was wise, but because he was just so sluggish and weary. He would shuffle around the dormitories in his dressing gown, looking hungover and highly cynical, muttering under his breath about how stupid the professors were. He completely checked out of the academic game. He was depressed, quite frankly.
But while he checked out of the formal classes, he definitely didn't check out of the intellectual life. Because this is where the story gets really cinematic. This is where he meets the two people who will fundamentally change the trajectory of his life. The three friends.
This is truly the Avengers Assemble moment of German philosophy. It is one of the most famous, intense, intellectual bromances in history. In one room, or at least sharing the same tight-knit dorm life, you have Hegel. You have Friedrich Hölderlin, who would go on to be arguably Germany's greatest lyric poet. And then a little bit later, you have Friedrich Schelling.
And Schelling is the real prodigy of the group, right?
Schelling is terrifyingly smart. He was 5 years younger than them. He actually entered the university at just 15 years old, but he was intellectually ferocious. He was the absolute wonderkind of the era.
Just imagine hanging out in that dorm room, Hegel, Hölderlin, Schelling. The conversations late at night must have been insane.
They were completely inseparable. They ate together, they drank copious amounts of wine together, and they complained endlessly about the seminary together. They formed a very tight, closed circle, and they bonded over three specific foundational things. First, they universally hated the old system of the seminary, the dry, dogmatic, lifeless theology they were being force-fed every day.
Which makes total sense. Teenagers hating their strict school is a timeless dynamic.
Second, they deeply loved ancient Greece. They completely idealized Athens. They looked back at ancient Greece and saw this mythical place where people were free, physically beautiful, and happy, where religion wasn't about sin and guilt, but about vibrant public festivals and art and community. They constantly contrasted that bright world with the stiff, gray, guilt-ridden world of German Protestantism they were trapped in.
And the third thing that bonded them.
The third thing was the absolute political bomb that went off in 1789, the French Revolution.
They are watching it happen in real time right across the border.
They are. We look back at 1789 as just another date in history. For them, sitting in that dark seminary, it was the apocalypse in the good sense of the word. It was the end of the old, corrupt world. They thought the kingdom of reason was literally arriving right next door. They were obsessed with the news.
There's that famous legend, Pinkard says it might be a myth, but it's a very sticky one, that they went out into a meadow near the school and planted a freedom tree.
And danced around it singing the Marseillaise. Whether it happened literally like that or not, it perfectly captures the truth of their spirit at the time. They were massive radicals. They were reading smuggled French newspapers in secret student clubs. They even developed their own code words to avoid the authorities.
Code words, like actual spycraft.
Intellectual spycraft, yeah. When they wrote letters to each other talking about the kingdom of God or the invisible church, the censors reading their mail would think, oh, what pious, lovely young men studying their theology. But they weren't talking about the Lutheran Church at all. They were talking about the revolution. They were talking about a new society of free, equal citizens based entirely on reason.
That is brilliant. Using the very language of their oppressors to talk openly about overthrowing them.
Exactly. But they weren't just political radicals. They were theological radicals, too. Which brings us to a really fascinating point in the source material called the pantheism controversy. Now, I know that sounds like a very dusty, niche academic dispute, but why was it such a massive deal for these three friends?
Yeah, the sources make it seem like this was the biggest scandal imaginable. What exactly was the pantheism controversy?
It was the scandal of the century for German intellectuals. Basically, in the late 18th century, a philosopher named F.H. Jacobi published letters revealing that Lessing, remember Hegel's big hero Lessing, had supposedly confessed on his deathbed that he was a Spinozist.
A follower of Spinoza.
Right, Baruch Spinoza, a Jewish philosopher from the 1600s whose books were widely banned. Spinoza argued that God and nature are exactly the same thing. Deus ex natura. God isn't a person. God isn't a king sitting on a throne up in the clouds judging you. God is the universe. God is the laws of physics. God is existence itself.
And to the Orthodox Church establishment, that sounds a lot like
atheism.
Yeah.
Flat out atheism. Because if God is everything, then God isn't the he who answers prayers. You can't pray to the law of gravity. The establishment was completely horrified. They literally called it the abyss of pantheism. But Hegel, Hölderlin, and Schelling, they absolutely loved it.
They just ate it up.
It was exactly what they were looking for. They even wrote a Greek phrase in each other's autograph books. Henkai Pan.
One and all.
One and all. It became their secret handshake, their motto. It meant, we entirely reject your separate, judgmental, angry God. We believe in a unified, living, breathing cosmos. We are all deeply connected. It was a spiritual stance, but it was also a deeply political stance.
How is it political, though? It sounds purely metaphysical.
Because if everything is one, if God is equally present in everyone and everything, then the duke is not inherently better than the peasant. The whole feudal hierarchy is a total lie. We are all equal parts of the exact same divine substance. So it was basically a metaphysical justification for radical democracy.
I see. So they have their secret Spinoza motto, they have their French revolutionary fervor, and yet they are still stuck in a classroom every day with conservative professors trying to systematically prove the Bible is literally historically true. How do they handle the actual academics?
They used Immanuel Kant as a weapon.
A weapon. Usually I think of Kant as the guy who writes books that are completely impossible to read, not a sword you swing in class.
He is that too, definitely. But there was a radical young tutor at the seminary named Carl Emmanuel Diaz, who was known as the Kantian Enrage. He actively taught the boys how to use Kant's critique of pure reason defensively. Kant argued very thoroughly that you cannot use pure logic to prove the existence of God or supernatural miracles. It's fundamentally impossible. Human minds just don't work that way. We can only know what we experience.
So when their Orthodox professor, Gottlob Storr, tried to use complicated logic to prove that the biblical miracles definitely happened,
students would raise their hands, quote chapter and verse of Kant, and just tear his arguments to shreds. They were using cutting-edge modern philosophy to publicly dismantle the old dogmas right there in the classroom. It was intellectual guerrilla warfare.
That sounds incredibly satisfying for a group of bored, rebellious 20-somethings. But eventually, school has to end. The seminary bubble has to burst. It's 1793. Hegel finally graduates. He's 23 years old. He flat out refuses to become a state pastor. But now he has a very real problem.
He is completely broke.
The classic millennial dilemma. You want to overthrow the corrupt capitalist system, but you also desperately need rent money.
And he has absolutely no academic reputation. Schelling was already publishing brilliant papers. Hölderlin was already getting known as a romantic poet. Hegel was just the old man. He had zero prospects. So he has to take the only job practically available to a theology graduate who refuses to take a parish. He becomes a Hofmeister.
A private tutor.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we need to be very clear here. This was a deeply humiliating job for someone of his intellect and pride.
Why humiliating, though? Isn't teaching considered a noble profession?
It is. But the social position of a Hofmeister at that specific time was completely awful. You were a live-in teacher for a rich aristocratic family. You physically lived in their massive house, but you weren't quite a servant. You didn't scrub the floors or cook the meals, but you absolutely weren't family either. You were in this terrible, awkward social limbo. You were way too educated to eat downstairs with the maids and the stable boys, but you weren't noble enough to actually sit and talk to the master or the wealthy guests upstairs. You were basically invisible.
That sounds incredibly isolating, just floating in the middle of this rigid class structure.
It was. And Hegel lands a job way out in Bern, Switzerland. This kicks off what Pankard famously calls his wilderness years.
It really was a wilderness. He is totally cut off from his vibrant friends. He's deeply lonely. And the irony of his placement is just rich. He gets hired by the von Steiger family.
Captain von Steiger.
And Captain von Steiger is not exactly a dance around the freedom tree kind of guy.
Far from it. Captain von Steiger was a fiercely reactionary Bernese oligarch. He was a high-ranking member of the ruling council of Bern. He was actively plotting against the French Revolution. He wanted to militarily crush the exact ideas that Hegel held so dear.
So Hegel, the radical Spinoza-loving Democrat, is now silently taking a paycheck from a guy who wants to violently restore the old feudal order.
It was totally soul-crushing for him. He writes these agonizing, depressing letters to Schelling, saying his wings are drooping. He literally feels like a failure. He says he feels condemned to the galleys. He's stuck teaching basic arithmetic to spoiled kids in the remote Swiss Alps, while his friends are becoming famous public intellectuals.
And I think this is the key to the whole deep dive today. This misery was actually highly productive. It wasn't just wasted time.
No, it was the essential crucible. Because the von Steigers had one thing that entirely saved Hegel's sanity.
A really good wine cellar.
Probably that too, knowing Hegel. But more importantly, a library. A massive, incredibly well-stocked library. And because Hegel had no local friends and absolutely nothing to do in the evenings, he just read. Constantly. And he didn't just read the standard German philosophy he was used to. He read the English and French Enlightenment authors, Montesquieu, Gibbon, and crucially, profoundly, Adam Smith.
The Scottish economist, the author of The Wealth of Nations.
This is the massive turning point. Most German philosophers at the time were strictly reading other German philosophers. They were sitting in their studies thinking about the mind and the spirit and the ego in these highly abstract terms. Hegel sits in this library and starts reading about money, about physical labor, about class dynamics, about how civil society actually functions on a practical daily basis.
He moves beyond the purely abstract freedom they talked about in the seminary and starts trying to understand the actual machinery of the modern world.
Exactly. He starts to clearly see that you can't just have high moral ideals. You have to fundamentally understand economics. He begins to see that the modern world is driven by labor, by markets, and by property. He would never have learned that if he had stayed comfortable in the seminary or got a cushy university job right away. He needed access to that rich oligarch's library to see how the world really worked.
So he's getting this intense crash course in reality.
Yeah.
And he's also writing furiously during this time, even if he isn't publishing anything yet. What is he working on in the background?
He's still heavily obsessing over religion, but not in a pious, orthodox way. He writes an entire manuscript called The Life of Jesus.
A biography of Jesus?
Sort of, but it's a total rewrite. Hegel rewrites the Gospels. But in his version, he ruthlessly strips out every single miracle. There is no walking on water, no multiplying loaves and fishes, and definitely no resurrection.
So what's left of the story?
A pure moral teacher. He basically turns Jesus into a German philosopher, essentially, a historical mouthpiece for Kantian morality. He portrays Jesus as a guy who just tried to teach pure reason and inner freedom to his followers.
And why did he fail? Because clearly, even in Hegel's version, the story ends with him getting crucified by the state.
Hegel argues that Jesus failed because the Jewish people of that specific historical time and the broader Roman world in general were too corrupted by their heavy reliance on strict external laws and rigid authority. They simply couldn't handle true inner freedom. So Jesus eventually had to compromise his message. He had to start speaking in confusing riddles. He had to demand blind faith from his followers instead of shared reason just to get them to listen.
This sounds like Hegel is desperately trying to figure out historical puzzle. Why did Christianity, which supposedly started out being about universal love and freedom, eventually turn into the oppressive, dogmatic church that he grew up with in Württemberg?
Exactly. He's tracing the corruption of an ideal. And he uses a philosophical term here that becomes very important for his later work. Positivity.
Positivity. Now, usually when we say that today, it means good vibes, being optimistic. But in Hegel's philosophy, it means something entirely different, right?
Right. For Hegel, a positive religion or a positive law is one that is posited, meaning it is artificially imposed from the outside. It's a rigid statute. It's a rule you follow blindly just because an old book says so, or a priest says so, or a king says so. It doesn't grow naturally from your own heart or your own reason. Hegel deeply hated positivity. He wanted a religion of subjectivity, one that felt alive, internal, and freely chosen.
So he's writing these radically subversive critiques of Jesus and the church in private, but he's also getting a bit bolder politically in public. The notes mention he engaged in some light treason while he was living in Bern.
A little bit of light treason, yes. There was a radical lawyer named J.J. Cart. Cart was a fiery revolutionary from the Vaud region, which was a territory that the city of Bern militarily controlled and oppressed. Cart wrote a scathing pamphlet exposing exactly how corrupt and tyrannical the Bernese oligarchy was. He was basically attacking Hegel's bosses, friends, and colleagues by name.
And Hegel gets his hands on this and reads it.
Hegel doesn't just read it. He anonymously translates the entire French pamphlet into German and adds his own snarky, biting footnotes to it. And he secretly gets it published.
That is incredibly bold. Just, here, let me peacefully teach your children basic math by day, and by night, I will literally translate and publish pamphlets about why your entire government is an illegal kleptocracy.
It really shows the depth of his frustration. He clearly saw the massive hypocrisy of the Bernese aristocrats. They loudly claimed to be free. Bern was technically a republic, but they were brutally oppressing their subject territories. It deeply radicalized Hegel. He realized that the word freedom for the political elites often just meant slavery for everyone else.
But he obviously couldn't sustain this double life forever. He was miserable. The mountains were oppressive to him. He desperately needed an out.
He did. And his rescue finally comes from his oldest best friend, Hölderlin.
Which brings us to part 4 of the outline, Frankfurt, the turning point.
Hölderlin had moved to the city of Frankfurt and secured a fairly comfortable job for himself. Seeing Hegel's despair, he pulled some strings and secured a job for Hegel too. He wrote to him and basically said, "Come here immediately. I have found you a position with a good family." The Gogels.
And the Gogels were wine merchants, if I remember correctly.
Wealthy wine merchants. And this is a massive vibe shift for Hegel. Brain was old, aristocratic, stiff, and highly conservative. Frankfurt was a booming commercial hub. It was busy, it was loud, it was full of international trade and new money. And the Gogels were thoroughly middle class, not stuck-up nobles who looked down on him.
Hegel moves there in 1797, and immediately you see a profound change in his personality and his letters.
He just breathes this huge sigh of relief. He actually writes a letter to a friend saying he has finally decided how howl with the wolves.
Howl with the wolves, that's a great phrase. What exactly did he mean by that?
It meant he decided to stop being such a judgmental, isolated prig. He decided to stop sitting alone on the sidelines, angrily judging the fallen world. He decided to actually participate in life. To assimilate. He bought much better clothes. He started going to the opera regularly. He started drinking good wine and actually enjoying it. He just relaxed.
And we even see a very different, softer side of him with a woman named Nanette Endel.
Nanette. This is such a great human detail that Pinkert uncovers from the archives. She was a close friend of the Gogol family, and she was living in the same household for a while. She was Catholic, which, Hegel usually looked down on as highly superstitious, but they clearly had this spark between them.
A real flirtation.
Definitely. They wrote these playful letters to each other even when they were living in the exact same city. She famously called him Saint Alexis.
Saint Alexis. Why?
She was gently teasing him. Alexis was a Catholic saint who supposedly lived under the stairs and was totally unrecognized by his own family. She was teasing him for being so serious, so monk-like, and so hiding his true self, and he absolutely loved it. He would playfully sign his letters back to her, "Your servant." It was light, it was fun. It shows us a Hegel who isn't just a giant brain floating in a jar. He was a young man entirely capable of charm and affection.
But while he's having a bit more fun and relaxing socially, his intellect is undergoing a massive foundational shift. And it really starts with the daily reunion with Hölderlin.
They are finally back together in the same city. They can talk face-to-face every single day. And this is totally critical to the history of philosophy. Hölderlin wasn't just a talented poet. He was a genuinely profound philosophical thinker in his own right, and he fundamentally changed Hegel's mind.
How so? What was the argument?
Well, up until now, Hegel was a very strict Kantian. He was highly analytical. He thought entirely in terms of binary oppositions, reason versus sensibility, duty versus inclination. Everything was a sharp binary. Hölderlin, however, was a poet of unity. He constantly talked about life and love as the ultimate forces. He convinced Hegel that you cannot just slice the world up into neat little pieces with cold logic. You have to feel the living, breathing connection of all things.
But Hölderlin's own life was rapidly becoming a dark tragedy right in front of Hegel's eyes.
It was completely heartbreaking. Hölderlin was working as a tutor for the very wealthy Gontard family in Frankfurt, and he fell madly, deeply in love with the wife, Suzette Gontard.
The classic disastrous tutor situation.
Yes, but it wasn't just a brief, sordid fling. They believed they were absolute soulmates. He immortalized her as Diotima in his most famous poems. It was a fiercely passionate but obviously doomed affair. Her powerful husband eventually found out, or at least strongly suspected, and he angrily forced Hölderlin to leave the house and the city.
And Hegel is just standing there watching all this unfold.
Hegel was the ultimate third wheel in this tragedy. He actually acted as the secret go-between for them. After Hölderlin was kicked out, he would sneak back to the outskirts of Frankfurt, and Hegel would physically pass the passionate, desperate letters between the separated lovers. He saw the intense pain up close. He saw the sheer, irresolvable conflict.
How did witnessing this profound romantic tragedy actually impact his philosophy, though?
It was absolutely central. Hegel began to clearly see that conflict isn't just a mistake in the system. It's not just a mathematical error we can fix. Conflict is the very core nature of reality. In this situation, you have two totally valid rights violently colliding. You have the universal right of true love between Hölderlin and Suzette, and you have the legal right of the family and civic society represented by the husband. Both are right in a profound sense, but they are completely incompatible. This is the essence of tragedy.
And this tragedy is what drives the story of history forward.
Exactly. This painful realization is the very seed of his famous dialectic. The idea that human history moves forward not through smooth, easy progress, but through tragedy, brutal conflict, and the painful struggle to reconcile irreconcilable opposites. He didn't learn that from a textbook. He learned that from watching his best friend's heart physically break.
That is just incredible context. And then right around this time, in 1799, another major life event happens, a much quieter one, but it changes his trajectory entirely. His father dies.
The Old System man finally passes away. and he leaves Hegel a modest but crucial inheritance.
How much money are we actually talking about here?
It was about 3,000 guilders. In today's money, it's hard to translate exactly, but maybe enough to live very modestly for a few years without working. It wasn't a massive fortune. He wasn't suddenly rich, but it was enough.
It was exactly the amount of forget-you money he needed.
Exactly. It meant he didn't have to be a humiliated private tutor anymore. He bought his freedom from the ruling class. He could finally stop teaching bratty aristocratic kids and start doing his real serious work.
And with that newfound financial freedom, he makes a huge decision. He officially abandons his old career goal.
Right. Up until this specific moment in Frankfurt, he deeply wanted to be a popular philosopher. He thought he could just write accessible, persuasive essays for the general public to educate them morally. But in Frankfurt, watching the French Revolution turn into the Reign of Terror and seeing the complexity of modern economics, he realizes that's simply not enough. The problems of the modern world, the social fragmentation, the death of traditional religion, the chaotic rise of capitalism, they were way too deep. You couldn't fix a broken world with a neatly written pamphlet.
So what does he realize he needs instead?
He realizes he desperately needs a system.
A system. That word always sounds slightly ominous when German philosophers use it.
It just means a totally comprehensive, unified theory that explains literally everything. Physics, biology, history, art, religion, politics, logic. He realized that to actually fix the modern world, you had to understand how all these seemingly disconnected pieces fit together into a single whole. You had to show the underlying rational structure of reality itself.
So he writes a letter to his old friend Schelling, who, remember, is now a massive, big-shot professor in Jena, and basically says, I'm finally coming, and I'm bringing a system.
He realizes that the Great Revolution wasn't going to happen out in the muddy streets anymore. Napoleon was rapidly taking over Europe. The chaotic, radical phase of the French Revolution was definitively ending. Hegel decided the true revolution had to happen in the mind. It had to be a revolution of absolute thought.
So he packs his bags. It's January 1801. He heads straight to Jena. But I have to ask, why Jena? Why this random, small German town?
It was a mix of accidental geography and very weird politics. The University of Jena was structurally unique in Europe. It was jointly owned by 4 different Saxon dukes.
4 dukes at the same time.
4 of them. And because 4 different people were technically in charge, no one was actually in charge. There was a massive, glorious power vacuum. And in that administrative vacuum, you had almost total freedom of speech. The different censors couldn't coordinate with each other to ban anything.
So it became this intellectual safe haven.
It was literally the Silicon Valley of 1800. The absolute smartest, weirdest, most highly creative people in Europe were all migrating there. Goethe, the undisputed greatest writer in German history, was living nearby in Weimar and loosely overseeing the university's affairs. The Romantics, the Schlegel brothers, Novalis, Tieck, they were all there, experimenting heavily with irony and deliberately breaking the boundaries between poetry and hard philosophy.
And the absolute king of them all in Jena was Fichte, right?
Johann Gottlieb Fichte, the absolute rock star of German idealism.
The notes actually say that students stood on ladders outside the windows just to hear him speak.
It was pure mania. Fichte was totally electrifying on stage. He completely redefined the purpose of the university. He stood at the podium and told the young students that they weren't just there learning dead facts. They were the literal vanguard of humanity's freedom. He called the scholar the priest of truth. He made doing abstract philosophy feel like the most urgent, important thing in the entire world.
And here comes Hegel, walking right into this boiling cauldron of absolute genius.
But he definitely doesn't walk in as a rock star.
No, he's 30 years old. He is completely unpublished. He's totally unknown to the public, and his small inheritance is rapidly running out.
He joins Schelling, but the dynamic is incredibly awkward. Schelling is the revered boy wonder, the famous highly paid professor. Hegel is, well, he's just Schelling's old, slow roommate from the Stift. He arrives and takes a position as a private dozen.
Which sounds very fancy and official.
It sounds fancy, but in reality, it means unsalaried lecturer. He literally had to stand at the physical door of the lecture hall and collect coins directly from the students as they walked in just to make money. If no one showed up to his lecture, he literally didn't eat that night.
Those are incredibly humble beginnings for the man who would basically conquer 19th century philosophy.
Very humble. And he was terribly nervous. His early lectures were reportedly just awful. He mumbled into his beard. He constantly shuffled his messy papers. He stared awkwardly at the ceiling instead of the audience. He certainly wasn't Fichte's.
But he had something that Fichte and Schelling didn't have. He had those dark, lost years.
That is the crucial defining point of his whole biography. Let's look closely at the scorecard here. Schelling had been highly famous since he was 20. He had never really struggled with the real world. Fichte was an academic firebrand. But Hegel had spent 7 agonizing years in the wilderness.
Let's pull that thread as we start to wrap up the deep dive today. We started this whole conversation looking for the human being hidden behind the marble statue, and we found a guy who basically failed for a solid decade.
We found a guy who was intellectually blocked, deeply depressed, and socially humiliated on a daily basis. But think about what that specific failure actually gave him. Because he was a lowly tutor, he deeply understood the vicious class system and the boiling resentment of the middle class. Because he was isolated and lonely and burned, he sat and read English economics and deeply understood the raw power of money, markets, and labor. Because he was profoundly religious but passionately hated the Orthodox Church, he wrestled with theology in a way that was personal and bleeding, not just abstract.
It seems like if he had been a massive success at 22, exactly like Schelling,
He would have been a mere flash in the pan. He would have been a brilliant but ultimately shallow prodigy. He probably would have written some very nice romantic poetry or some highly abstract, empty logic. But because he simmered in that wilderness for so long, his philosophy gained an incredible weight. It had the actual grit and dirt of reality baked into it.
he intimately needed his own personal struggle to even begin to understand the broader struggle of human history.
Precisely. Hegel's mature philosophy is famously all about how spirit, which is his specific word for humanity or collective human consciousness, has to necessarily go through deep alienation. It has to feel completely lost. It has to suffer. Only by going painfully through the negative can you ever achieve true, reconciled self-knowledge. Hegel knew with absolute certainty that was true because he had physically lived it.
He knew that you don't get to the absolute truth by simply skipping over all the bad parts. You have to go directly through them.
That is the core lesson. The popular myth of Hegel, the dry, state-worshipping absolutist, is completely fundamentally wrong. The historical reality is a desperate man who was trying his hardest to save the modern world from its own terrifying fragmentation.
He was basically trying to be the new priest for a completely secular age.
He realized traditional religion just couldn't hold an industrializing society together anymore. The old gods were effectively dead. So he offered philosophy instead. He offered a massive system that could look bravely in the brutal chaos of history, the bloody wars, the failed revolutions, the economic pain, and rationally explain it. He desperately wanted to help us feel at home in the modern world, even when the world is profoundly scary and changing fast.
That is a pretty beautiful, noble goal, even if the books themselves are still incredibly hard to read.
The hardest books in the canon, honestly, but maybe the most historically necessary ones. He didn't just want to coldly understand the world from an armchair. He genuinely wanted to save it through the power of thought.
So here's a final provocative thought to leave you with today. We so often look at our own lost years. Our personal failures, our dead-end jobs, our long periods of depression or feeling stuck as just wasted time. We see them as embarrassing gaps on the resume that we need to hide.
But if we look closely at Hegel's life, maybe those are exactly the years where the real, invisible work is happening. Maybe the grand system of your life is quietly being built in the dark, during those exact moments when you think absolutely nothing is happening at all.
Maybe you fundamentally need to wander in the wilderness before you can ever find the promised land.
I strongly think Hegel would agree with that.
It's definitely something for all of us to mull over. Thanks for diving deep with us today.
It's an absolute pleasure.